Tonight, I am delighted to welcome the Reverend Dr. Andre Johnson for a discussion of his new book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner. And I'm going to begin with a little introduction of Dr. Johnson, and then we'll jump right into questions. And I'd encourage those of you who are participants this evening to submit questions as well via the chat or the Q&A. I'll be looking for those from time to time, and I'll work those in as possible. So Andre Johnson is the Associate Professor of Rhetoric and Media Studies in the Department of Communication and Film at the University of Memphis, right here in Memphis, Tennessee. He teaches classes in African American public address, rhetoric, race and religion, media studies, interracial communication, rhetoric and popular culture, and hip hop studies. He's also a frequent instructor at Memphis Theological Seminary, where he was a professor for a number of years before going on to the University of Memphis. He's currently collecting and editing the works of AME Church Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner under the title The Literary Archive of Henry Mcneal Turner. He's already published the first 6 volumes, and a 7th one is set for publication, I believe, this year or early next, Andre?
Next year.
Next year. He's also the curator and director of the Henry Mcneal Turner Project, a digital archive dedicated to the writings and study of Bishop Turner. In addition to collecting and editing writings of Bishop Turner, he's the co-author with Amanda Nell Edgar of a great book, which I highly recommend, The Struggle Over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter from 2018. That won the 2018 National Communication Association African American Communication and Culture Division Outstanding Book Award. He's also the author of course, the book we're going to be talking about tonight, The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner and the African American Prophetic Tradition. Excuse me, that was a book that you did back in 2012. Is that correct, Andre?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. He's the editor of Urban God Talk, Constructing a Hip Hop Spirituality, 2013. He's got a long CV. I printed it out today because I was working on a little reference for Dr. Johnson with multiple conference presentations, public events, interviews. This guy gets around town and around the nation, talking with folks from in all settings. So along with this academic work, we put the Reverend in front of Reverend Dr. Andre Johnson because he's the senior pastor of Gifts of Life Ministries, a church here in Memphis that builds upon the servant leadership philosophy. So his latest book right now is No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So welcome, Dr. Johnson, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Pete, for having me, and thanks to Memphis Theological Seminary, my seminary. I tell people all the time, if you appreciate any of my work, any of my scholarship, any of the things that I do out in the community, even my preaching, my pastoring, my faith leanings, my spiritual upbringing, all of it. If you appreciate any of that, Memphis Theological Seminary deserves to take some credit. All the good, give it to the seminary. All the bad, just put it all on me. So, so thanks again to the seminary for this opportunity to share. Again, and I want to thank you. You mentioned the book that Dr. Edgar and I wrote, The Struggle Over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And I remember not too long ago, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, you were so gracious and to want to talk with us about that book as well too, when the paperback came out. So thank you again for that as well.
Glad to have you back. So
Yeah.
let's jump in and talk about this book. I was telling Andre right before we began the formal live presentation here that I've just finished reading this book and how much I enjoyed it. It is a very readable book. It's written by a scholar for scholars, but uh, I think average folks like myself can understand it as well. And it actually leads me to a question about the book, which is, um, why'd you write this book? What led you to do this work?
No, great question. Uh, well, as you know, Pete, and maybe some of the viewers know this already, but for others, this may be new, but I've been working on Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner since 2005, when I was in graduate school, when I discovered a speech, um, September 3rd, 1868. I claim the rights of a man, that's what it's commonly called. But the actual title, at least the title of the pamphlet that came out a little bit later after he gave that speech, is on the eligibility of colored members to have seats in the Georgia legislature and legislator. So that was the long-winded title of that speech. But when I read that speech, it just spoke to me. It was just powerful, it was prophetic. It was something that I wanted to do more work on or analyze. So I began to start to research on this figure that I never heard about. Come to find out that when I began my research, I just thought it was going to be limited sources of material. I was hoping just to find enough to craft out a dissertation. But lo and behold, when I started digging, there was a whole just bunch of writings, a whole cornucopia of letters and letters to the editor and just writings and newspapers and books throughout the late 19th, early 20th century. So I'm like, wow, this person was real huge in his day. And so when I began to decide how I wanted to write the dissertation, I decided to look at 4 speeches because my degree is in communication at the University of Memphis, as you know, and my area of focus is rhetorical criticism, rhetorical criticism. And so I selected 4 extant or whole speeches that I could offer a rhetorical analysis around. And it lined up perfectly, actually. 1866 to 1868 was chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 3 and 4 was a speech from 1893 to 1895. So I actually wrote a dissertation that examined Bishop Turner's rhetorical trajectory from 1866 to 1895. And basically, I wanted to ask the question, in PhD studies, it's the why question. Why? What do you want to discover? Well, I want to discover how a person can be in 1866, right after the Civil War. Let bygones be bygones. Let us be brothers and sisters. Let us work together and let's just forget about the past. To 1895, there's no future for the Negro in this country. How do you move from that? So that was the dissertation, which became my first book, The Forgotten Prophet, Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner in the African American Prophetic Tradition. So I stopped at 1895, always knowing that I was going to do a sequel. And that's what I call, I think that's what I put in the introduction of the book. I said, you can look at No Future as a sequel because I pick up 1896 to his death in 1915. So it was already in the works, already in my mind, in the planning that I will do this second book to continue because I really wanted to study that prophetic pessimism that I argue that Turner eventually develops later on in his career, and it stayed with him throughout the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm. So say a little bit more about just what is that prophetic pessimism?
Right.
Um, what characterizes it? How's it evident in his
Yeah.
work?
Yeah. I mean, now remember, I started this in 2005. So 2006, 2007, I'm putting together, I'm comping, I'm doing my prospectus, and I'm just trying to come up with some terms. I'm trying to come up with, what am I looking at? What am I reading? What am I looking at here on this page? And what I began to notice, um, first from Turner and then from others, which led me to talk about the African American prophetic tradition. And that's another, we can talk about that a little bit later, or we can talk about it at another time, because uh, in The Forgotten Prophet, my dissertation, and then the first book, I make an argument that the African American prophetic tradition, or the Black prophetic tradition, is different from our, at least from the communication scholars' understanding of the prophetic tradition, of what I would call the European notions of the prophetic tradition and prophetic rhetoric. For instance, European tradition is birthed out of an idea of liberty and freedom, where the Black prophetic tradition is birthed in slavery. And I got that nice paragraph type of definition about the Black prophetic tradition. So what I began to understand within that Black prophetic tradition was that there were different personas that speakers took in order to try to invite their audience to do something. So I'm looking at all of these speeches, and I think I read about 300 speeches. I'm just looking at all these, and I'm noticing a genre, I'm noticing a trend. And the first one was this whole notion of celebratory prophecy, where Turner is engaged, and I use Turner as the example. After the Civil War is fought and the Union won, Turner is arguing now we can celebrate into the greatness that is of America. He does this wonderful speech where he talks about America is what Daniel, the biblical book of Daniel, was talking about. The stone cut out of the mountain, and the stone is America, and people from all across the world are going to come and get freedom and democracy and learn what liberty is all about. And we now can celebrate. A celebratory prophecy. You heard a lot of that after the 2008 election, of Obama. Now 40 years from King's Day. I mean, you heard it all. So that's one. Then this whole notion of representative prophecy. After the optimism kind of wears off, now you're focused in representing the people that you claim to represent. The third one is a more pragmatic prophecy, where now it is time for you to begin to have, you got to cut some deals, you got to make some promises come true. So you got to deal with folk, and you got to cut some folk off where you embrace others. And then there's a lot of give and take. Turner does that, especially with the ACS, the American Colonization Society. And then the last one is this pessimistic tradition, where the racism is so entrenched and so strong that there are no deals to be made, because nobody really wants to make deals with you. When you have tried moral suasion, you have tried all of your arguments, you have tried the Jeremiah apocalyptic way, you have tried it all. And so what pessimism does for the prophet is, it's not nihilism. And I try to make that distinction in the book. It is not a total giving up. It is a recognition that nothing would change in the immediate future, that I must stay focused on my call in order for me to, if I just want to get a little bit melodramatic, in order for me to live and breathe, that if I don't do this, that I am not fulfilling my call. So what Turner does is, he's not saying that America is the stone cut out of the mountain. He is not saying that the covenant arrangement is going to be a blessing for African Americans, because African Americans could never be a part of it. Pessimism, prophetic pessimism, is when the prophet now begins to speak out on the behalf of the people and telling the world how the people are really feeling, what's really going on, speaking truth to power and representing those voices that are not, they don't have a voice. They are already speaking themselves, but they are now being represented by this individual that they deem as the prophet. And then they can say, well, you know what? I knew I wasn't crazy. Somebody feels the same way that I'm doing. So that's what I was trying to talk about as it relates to prophetic pessimism, that you're not bounded by what I like to call toxic optimism, that when something doesn't come the way that you think it's going to come, just because you march or you protest one time, and if, the powers that be don't just say, you know what, Brother Johnson, you're right. I'm going to just give up our power and acquiesce to you. You're not just quitting, because you already understand that what you're doing now is bearing witness, and you're leaving a record. And what prophetic pessimistic prophets do is lift up those voices and then also leave a record for people to say, well, there was somebody saying something different. And that's why we kind of like them even today. That's why we go back to look at King's writings, Fannie Lou Hamer's writings, Francis Ellen Watkins Harper's writings, and a whole host of others.
Do some connecting of that with Frank Wilderson's concept of Afro-pessimism.
And I had to remember now, when I was doing this again, that, and this was something I had to, work and interrogate when I was writing No Future, because back in 2005, I'd never heard of Afro-pessimism. I am trying to craft up this prophetic pessimism piece. And I'm glad that I did, because I do see some similarities. This whole notion of, for instance, race. One of the things that Turner does in his pessimistic stage is he begins to develop this strong understanding of race and racial concepts and this whole notion of racism. He begins to understand it more than just prejudice. The 19th century word for what we now commonly call racism was prejudice, was proscription, special treatment, those type of words. Turner was beginning to start to say, no, it's because of Blackness. So one of the strengths of Afro-pessimism is that they remind us about, it's just not necessarily race, it's anti-Blackness. And Turner is beginning to understand that anti-Blackness is at work in America during the late 19th century. Anti-Blackness is actually what builds this whole understanding of a white nationhood, or the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP. That this whole notion of anti-Blackness is the undergirding that Blackness, something is inherently wrong with it. So when Turner was saying, we need to go to Africa, for instance, because we need to get around people that look like us, that appreciate us, and we need to get away from the language that destroys us. Everything that's good is white. Everything that's bad is Black. Now, I know when I, tell my students that at the University of Memphis, they think it was Malcolm X. Well, yeah, Malcolm did say something like that, but Turner was saying it in 1890. And he was writing about this. And he began to understand that if Blackness, if anti-Blackness is the foundation, then what does this say about religion and faith? And I know we're going to get to that in a separate question, but I just want to talk about it just a little bit, because it's important to the Afro-pessimism argument. One of the things that Afro-pessimism believe also is there's no role of agency. In prophetic discourse, it's all agency. It's agency of the person, because the person, the prophet, is in direct contact with God. Turner is a preacher, and Turner is a man of faith, and he is holding on to his belief in God. So God gives him the agency to speak. So that's one of the major differences that between Afro-pessimism and the prophetic pessimism that I talk about. Agency still matters. And that's why he can go into the religious discourse of his day and begins to reinterpret an understanding of God, and then eventually say God is a Negro. Adam and Eve were Black. The first people were Black. And Blackness is the first mode of creation. This is 1893, the first mode of creation. When God said, let there be light, that's when, as far as Turner is concerned, that's when all the issues started to come. You know, Genesis 1, 1 and 2, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth without void. Well, that's the creation in darkness for Turner. And so he begins to look at religion, politics, the discourse of his day, totally different. And he was picking up on those anti-Black strands that now, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Wilkerson, Kende, and a whole host of others talk about now when they talk about their anti-racism work.
There was references you were speaking there about Turner making the assertion in 1898 of in his editorial, God is a Negro, that Negroes should worship a God who is a Negro. And where do you think he got that? And well, yeah, let's talk about that first. Sort of where did that come from in his own life and experience, and then we can think about its importance theologically and politically.
Once again, Turner is wrestling with and understanding. First of all, it's the age-old question, right? The age-old question, why, Lord, is all of this happening to us? We are trying to be faithful. What is really going on? And so he's wrestling with that question. And he doesn't call it this, but we talk about it now as theodicy, right? So he's wrestling with theodicy, and he is trying to figure out what's really going on, why all of this is happening to Black people, and Black people are just trying to be faithful and trying to do right and be right. And what happens is, I talk about when I get to chapter 2 in the book, after the Plessy decision, he begins to now think that, wait a minute, come to think of it, the Supreme Court is racist. And their decisions are racist. Their discourse is racist. What other discourses are racist? Oh yeah, even in our own church, the discourses are racist, because Black people do not even believe that African Americans could actually have the image of God. Now, I know intellectually you say that, but do you really fully believe it? I mean, I saw some of the examples when I was doing the research on this book and the first book. But there were preachers, Pete, that were Black preachers that were actually preaching sermons that were telling Black congregants, let us live right, let us be right, so when we die, we can all become white and God will accept us. Mm. And Turner thought that was anathema. He was like, no. And so I credit his whole reorientation around, thinking about, re-examining religion and his faith discourse, and then eventually getting to God as a Negro, his first trip to Africa. And he meets on the ship going to Africa from England, an African. And the whole understanding of Africans, Turner's whole understanding of Africans, could make for a book by itself. So if anybody wants to write a book, you can write one on Turner's interpretation and belief in Africa. But he sees this person not as, quote, a heathen, but as an intellectual scholar, which this person was. And they began to start talking about God and religion and faith. And he began to have these conversations to Turner about the role of Blackness in your theology. Mm-hmm. And Turner takes that, goes back home and begins to start thinking it, reprocessing it. And then all of a sudden he comes up with a rereading. It started with the rereading of Genesis 1 and 2. The earth was created and it was void and darkness covered the earth. And then God said, let there be light. Whereas certain people, certain theologians were saying that there were two creation stories or polygenesis theory of creation. Turner is like, no, it's one. And it was in Blackness that light or whiteness came out of. Mm-hmm. So if the predominant color in the world is black, then God must be black. That was his reason. And then that begins a whole line of speeches and sermons that really got him into some hot water in certain places, but also got him a lot of respect because he was doing something that, even lay people were really thinking about at times.
So he ran into some resistance, this notion of that God is black, God is a Negro. He ran into resistance to that from members of his own race. And tell us a little bit about that resistance and how he countered it and why that resistance was even there.
Turner always believed, and I was trying to, I think that's in chapter 2, and I wanted to find this quote where Turner is responding to one of the Black people who, after he heard Turner say God is a Negro, he got kind of upset and said that if he gets to heaven, the minister said, if I get to heaven and find out that God is black, I'll take my hat and leave, and Turner like, what kind, Turner called him a ministerial coon. What kind of ministerial coon is that, and he is leading people, shame on us or something like that. But Turner began to understand something else when he starts to unpack this anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness had affected Black people as well. And part of the reason that Turner said that many Black folk did not want to go to Africa, he's not talking about the ones who could not go because of the money. Even the few ones that had the money to make a trip to Africa and to immigrate, they did not want to go because they did not believe that they could build or sustain anything without a white person's help. Mm-hmm. And this is Turner. Turner is saying that you have been beaten down for so long that you don't think that you can do anything on your own, using your own agency, like immigration or like doing whatever. Now, that's kind of strong, Turner, because, at the same time he's saying this, people were building schools, they were building businesses, they were trying to do whatever they could do. But the way that some Black people talked and believed by other Black people, some of the same stuff that still goes on today. Some of the poor Black people, some of the more well-off, if you want to use that term, Black people look down on certain Black people. That was going on in Turner's day, and he did not like it, and he thought that it was grounded in an understanding of anti-Blackness. And he called it out, and he gave as good as he got, because people came after Turner, and Turner came right back after them. If you want to just, you ought to just get you a 19th century Black newspaper and read some of those debates that were going on those pages. I mean, just for everybody to see. They were at each other, but they still understood, most of them still understood the larger picture. And the larger picture was that if we are going to survive, we're going to have to stick together. We can vehemently disagree, but we still going to have to stick together. But so that's what Turner is critiquing anti-Blackness and how Black people were believing, or were beginning to believe, that certain Black people were living and acting, and he thought that it was just bad. You know, people using lightning cream, and talking about good hair, bad hair, good lips, bad lips, big nose, kinky hair. This is in his writings. He's writing about this in 1895. And lifting up the beauty of African American women, and celebrating them. Because at this same time, as we know, they were looked at as mammies or sapphires or Jezebels, and were not respected in this Victorian womanhood space at all. And Turner is saying, no, don't look at our women like this just because white people look at our women like that. So
one of the powerful lines it's on page 43 of the book that's related to what we were just talking about here. It says, Turner began to understand that African Americans would continue to feel undervalued and unappreciated until they at least could believe that God stood with them, that God was for them, and indeed that God looked like them. In short, God could no longer represent white. God had to represent Black. Indeed, for Turner, God had to be Black.
mm-hmm.
And it's echoes of James Cone and others. But this is in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering what, from the standpoint of your rhetorical analysis, but also you're a theologian, what's Turner claiming? Because, I mean, he's not, or is he? I mean, what is he trying to say by saying that God is Black? What is he meaning by that?
And that's a whole, in that chapter 2, I'll go into what I'm calling rhetorical theology.
Uh-huh.
What Turner is finding, what Turner is doing, it's not a systematic treatment of God or the Godhead or the Trinity or anything like that. He is actually in a sermon or in a speech, in a public declaration, in real time, theology on the go, as I like to say. Paul, when he's writing and traveling, he's doing, those letters were like theology on the go. Mm-hmm. Turner is inviting his audience to begin to understand God in a different way. We addressed this a little bit in chapter 3 of The Struggle over Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, chapter 2 in this book. The whole notion of rhetorical theology, at its core, all theology. And this is what, and this is I won't say a unique contribution, because other people were doing something similar, reinterpreting the text or looking at things different. But Turner is actually saying to his audience, you have the right and the privilege to see God differently, because God's self is a rhetorical construction. Mm-hmm. Humans talk about God. That's the best we can do. I mean, going back to what you bring it up, James Cone, this whole notion of God talk, that human being, we come up with dogma and doctrine and what we believe God is like, or how God acts in a certain situation. And Turner is inviting Black people in 1895 to get involved into the conversation. You do not have to accept somebody else's caricature of who God is. God is Black. God loves you. God cares about you. God recognizes your pain, your suffering, and God is there with you. You are not accursed, a curse or a curse of God. Turner early on did, and many others before him did excellent exegesis on the curse of the Noah curse or the curse of Ham and all of that. And so Turner is inviting his audience, probably for many of them for the first time, to see themselves as God sees them, as images of God. And it's okay to say God is Black. And for a lot of Black people who have been so subsumed by white theology, and this is what the Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher talks about even today. He is with the hammer, right? Just trying to break that embedded theological paradigm that not white people, many Black folks still have. Preaching Black liberation theology and white theological frameworks, right? So Turner is in 1895 inviting his audience to see the difference it would make if you really believe that God is for you and God is with you. Then maybe you can believe that you can have the agency to actually do something about your situation, to do something proactive about your situation, like leave. And real quick, many people will argue that Turner's rhetoric failed, especially his immigrationist rhetoric, because many Black people, or millions of Black people that he wanted, did not go to Africa. Well, millions would have gone if they had the money. That was not even the issue. Letters came in daily into his office and to the office of the ACS and to all the offices that were receiving letters about people wanting to go to Africa. But you know what Black folk did do? They got out of the South. They left as far as their money could take them. And I so happen to believe, and I talk about this in chapter 5, is that the rhetoric that Turner was espousing, because he stayed in the South, he was the bishop of the South. He stayed there in Atlanta all of his public career as a bishop. And he is telling them that you can do this. You have to believe in God and believe that God believes in you, and then believe in yourself to do what it is that you feel God is calling you to do. And a lot of Black people went as far as their money could take them.
It's a good way to put it. There's a theologian who talks about what God represents in our language and the way we speak and think, is that God represents what's the highest good, the highest beauty, and the highest truth. And so if God is Black, then that skewers the usual racist, white supremacist way of constructing the world. And in a way, what Turner's doing is really, it's a very effective skewering of that whole system, because it knocks out the most fundamental, the foundational block of that system, which is to claim that whiteness is the ultimate good, the ultimate truth, and the ultimate beauty. And what Turner's saying is no, it's quite the opposite of that. Blackness is.
And that God intended it to be that way. I think I found a passage that I would like to just share with the audience. Just 2 quick passages about that. And I'm in chapter 2 on page 57. And what I was talking about in the beginning, so at the top of 57, I write, the Grenada Sentinel wrote that if Adam and Eve were Black and that white people were a result of evolutionary change, as Turner charged, it was then thankful to evolutionary change. The paper bases reasoning not in its own racist beliefs, but in what it argued was African Americans' hatred of themselves. We have never yet seen, they wrote, and this is Grenada Sentinel, Grenada, Mississippi, a Black man that was proud of his color. But we have been approached by quite a number of inquiring colored citizens and asked seriously, why is it that their skin was Black and ours white? While admitting that they did not know, the writer immediately shifted to a colorblind solution to the problem by declaring that only if presumably Black folks will follow the footsteps of Christ our Savior, color, races, classes, and castes will disappear beyond this stage of existence. So Turner is trying to say Adam and Eve was Black, but this newspaper editorial responded, well, you know, if that's the case, then why are all these Black people always coming up to us bemoaning the fact that they're Black? You know, why are they wanting to be white? Why are they finding all of these lightning creams and trying to change their features? And if they're light enough to pass, many of them did pass for white. And so, yes, so Turner is responding to that. And then I finally found the other piece that I was made mention to you earlier on page 58. One Black man who, after he heard Turner say God is a Negro, who identified himself as not being a race man, declared, if I should get to heaven and find only Negroes there, I think I will want to take my hat and walk out. Yet another approached Turner after he finished his sermon and asked if Turner was afraid that God would curse him. Listen, God would curse him for calling God a Negro. Turner mused later in an editorial in the Voice of Missions newspaper. Had I called him a buckra or said that God was white or that God resembled a white man, that ministerial coon would have shouted. Turner continued, no race that does not believe that they bear the likeness and similitude of God would never amount to anything. The American Africans believe they resemble the devil, and hence the contempt they have for themselves and each other. The bulk of American Negroes believe that they are made like the devil, look like the devil, and the bulk of them act like the devil. It is as much impossible to develop a race of symmetrical and common sense Negroes in this country who are worshiping white gods all the time as it is to build a railroad to the moon.
Mm-hmm. Powerful stuff. It raises for me the where you're talking about how people couldn't understand couldn't understand why people wanted to lighten their skin, or why they didn't have this racial. If God was Black, why wouldn't they have this racial pride? So God must not be Black. And it threw me back to an earlier discussion that you had on page 24 about Black abstraction and white innocence, and you're drawing on Ross. Okay, I'm not finding Thomas Ross, legal scholar. Say a little bit. What is this Black abstraction, and how does it lead into or support? How does Ross talk about this with white innocence? Because it seems to me like this is quintessential liberalism, the Black abstraction and white innocence.
Right. Well, and right here in the book on page 24, I just found it. Black abstraction is the rhetorical depiction of a Black person in an abstract context outside of any real or rich social context. And then according to Rock, Black abstraction pervaded the rhetoric of race in the 19th century. And basically what Ross is saying, and which I totally agree with, if you read some of the decisions in the 19th century, especially during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction era, they were interpreting the Constitution without even making a nod or a look or just a wink toward the contextual situation and the realities that was actually happening. They would be, and I liken them to the originalist that we have today.
Yes.
So the 14th Amendment, for instance, and these, and you know, legal scholars debate this all the 14th Amendment is written, of course, for African Americans, for citizenship, you know, birthright citizenship. But what does it get interpreted for? Corporations becoming people, you know? And so this whole notion of Black abstraction, as if Black folk were just not even real, that like, oh, okay, well, you know, separable equal is the law of the land, and it is not, you know, taking any rights away from you because you were never meant to be socially equal to white people, Black folk. You just are meant to be equal legally and civilly. So as long as the institutions were equal, you were okay. But we all know that the institutions were not equal, and that was the point. Mm-hmm. And that's one of and that was one of the strategies that eventually that led to the Brown v. Board of Education, Charles Hamilton Houston, and then, of course, later Thurgood Marshall began to attack the equal part of that ruling, and then finally went all in with the whole separate but equal piece in 1954. So Black abstraction is this whole notion of interpreting a text without context, mm-hmm. without an understanding of the real lives that you are shaping and molding by doing so.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think of like how somebody talks about white folks talk about affirmative action as reverse discrimination. It totally ignores the social, political, economic realities around race as they've been constructed and maintained by white supremacy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It says, no, they're just people, just like everybody else.
I mean, this is
Black Lives Matter argument, actually.
Right. This is Chief Justice Roberts' argument about race. He says that when it came to stripping the Voting Rights Act of the preclearance, that we have African Americans that have been elected now. We don't need that anymore. And the only reason that we have a problem with race is because we keep talking about race. Right. I'm like, that's funny. Race is the only problem that will go away if you don't talk about it. Every other problem, you're supposed to talk about it, you know, to come to a common understanding, but, you know, except for race. So, yeah, I mean, you know, and without the context and the social context that brought the case even forward to begin with, you know, you just take that out and you just interpret a text without context, and you can abstract and you can make it sound and mean anything.
Mm-hmm. One of the things we were talking about before we invited in the general public was the kind of strangeness of how Turner was ignored from shortly after his death, and really until you start doing this serious scholarship on him. He's not been a person who's been around in sort of the popular pantheon of African-American heroes in American history. Mm-hmm. He's just not been there. What happened? Why do you think that happened?
I really believe that Turner died May 8th, 1915 in Ontario, Canada, owned church business, had a stroke, and he finally had one 15 years earlier in 1900, the beginning of the year, and bounced back from that one. Always walked, I think, the readings, the history will show that he walked with a limp and finally succumbed May 8, 1915. But during this time, there was a total shift in African-American thinking. It was the NAACP had been created and started. And so there was this major push at integration, not assimilation, but integration, and enjoying the full rights of citizenship, whatever that might look like. So when he dies in 1915, many of his immigration ideas, many of his agitative and volatile rhetoric and all of that kind of dies with him. And Du Bois actually, talks about him, as a, let's see, yeah, here it is. Turner was a man of tremendous force and courage as army chaplain, pastor, and bishop. He always been a man of strength. He's the last of his clan, mighty men, physically and mentally, men who started at the bottom and hammered their way to the top by sheer brute strength. They were the spiritual prodigy of the African chieftains, and they built the African church in America. But now we have the new Negro, or the educated Negro, or the Negro that can do other things. So we don't need that type of leadership anymore. And it, kind of, ferreted out to the scholarship, even with Du Bois not writing too much on Turner outside of his eulogy of him. Carter G. Woodson not writing that much, or any of the earlier academic historians of the 20th century that were writing for the Journal of Negro History. You don't get your first Turner article academically until 1938, Batten's article. Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner, Negro Extraordinaire. And then in 1964, you get a Dunning School apologist by the name of E.M. Coulter writing a negative takedown of Turner's career and his work. And so you get an article here, article there, and people just kind of forgot about him. But it's very interesting, as I talk about in the conclusion of the book, that many of the ideas and many of the things that we will subscribe to other folk in the 20th century, Turner foreshadowed.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about Back to Africa, we immediately think Marcus Garvey. But Turner was the one who did actually get people to go to Africa, who actually did travel to Africa 4 different times. When we talk about Black nationalist rhetoric, this whole notion about understanding about race and stuff, we think Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad. Turner is doing that there. The only person that I have found that actually in the 20th century, scholar, that actually cites Turner as an inspiration, not that he does any deep work on Turner, but as an inspiration, is James Cone. When he's talking about Black theology, Black power, and Jesus as being Black, he mentions Cone. No one else I have found so far. And if you find that, anybody that's listening to me, if you found someone in the 20th century that cites Turner, let me know, because I really want to know that and include that in upcoming works. But right now, I have not found anyone that have cited Turner as an inspiration or as someone to look at as part of, and one of the reasons for the book and one of the reasons for my work is because I do believe that not only is he part of the African-American prophetic tradition, and as Gary Dorian, your good friend, says that he's part of the Black social gospel tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Turner is also part of the African American intellectual tradition. And that's one of the things that I want to, hopefully with this book, that we can begin to see him as an intellectual. He did not go to school. He could not go to school when he was coming up. He was self-taught, but by the time he was finished, he could read and write and read Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and wrote on many various subjects and had a library that was rumored to be one of the best libraries, not just in Black Atlanta, but in Atlanta, period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a sense in which he's a precursor to a number of kind of ways of activism and thought that's current today. Or he's at least an ancestor in the faith along those lines. In your final chapter, you raise that question: if Turner were here today, what might he say? And I'm wondering if you see any parallels between sort of the celebratory prophetic times of the Obama presidency and the pessimistic prophecy times in which we live right now, and how Turner might help us get through these times in ways that encourage agency, not
he will be continually bearing witness, verbally, definitely, in this time. He would probably push for, I think for Turner would be, so let me start this way. Turner would be surprised that African Americans have achieved so much in this country. First of all, that would have been like very surprising to Turner. It's like, oh my God, I didn't know. But with all of that, Turner would be still challenging us to use this prosperity, to use this education, to use this knowledge now to be better and do better, starting at home and then going out abroad. Turner will just still be bearing witness, will still record and chronicle the pain of the oppressed and the suffering, and leaving a record like he did back in the 19th century, that we can go back and some of the key historical events that happened in this country. And this is another thing to really appreciate Turner about. Turner had a long public career. Turner's career starts in earnest in 1857 when he becomes a licensed Methodist Episcopal minister and traveling with a white minister to different parts of the South, preaching the gospel. And he lived in antebellum period, the Civil War, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, and the turn of the 20th century. And he saw a whole lot. So Turner would still, his voice would still be powerful, and he would still give as good as he gets, as he got.
Yeah, I mean, he straddles that time period of the war to the construction of Jim Crow. I mean, the Civil War through Jim Crow, and that sort of that brief moment of Reconstruction, that brief moment of hope, and then the utter crushing of that hope following Reconstruction.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's what go ahead.
I mean, and he saw all of that and didn't quit though. And he didn't go to Africa. He could have. Matter of fact, people were hoping that they would have paid, some folk would have paid for him to go to Africa or go to Canada and become part of the British Methodist Episcopal Church that was birthed out of the AME Church. He could have at least gone up north to Philadelphia and, and hung out there. But he stayed in the South, and he stayed where he suffered the indignities of the people he claimed to represent as well. I mean, just because he was a bishop, he still had to ride in the dirtiest parts of the trains. He did not get first class service.
Even when he had the stroke, the first stroke.
Right, right, right. So, yeah, so Turner is still grounded in faith in God. And if there is one more other thing I can say about the pessimistic tradition is that for the prophet clings onto her faith or his faith in the creator or the divine, even more so, knowing probably nothing would change, but at least I'm holding on to something that if by miracle it does change, I will celebrate that and I will say that's good.
Mm-hmm.
But it gets me up in the morning, Turner would say, and to go out and to do the work. And he died doing the work that he felt called to do.
And I don't know if he touches upon this in his own writings, but to me that sounds very much like he can have that continual strength and passion and inspiration because he believes something that since God is black, that God is on the side of those like himself who are struggling for justice in the way in which he was struggling. Does he have anything in his writings that suggests that sort of that he makes that connection?
No, I think you're right. Yeah, he does. He does. And he was rumored to, and I wish he had gotten around to doing this, and we probably would have gotten more because I think that is the logical progression of this type of faith. But Turner was rumored to be writing a theological treatise. He had began, and we don't know, it's been lost to history. So again, if anybody have any Turner writings or any Turner papers in their attic or basements, or you know of folk that might have some, let me know. Let me know, because we want to try to collect as much as we possibly can. Much of my collection have just been through newspapers and much of it, again, shout out to Memphis Theological Seminary. When I finished my graduate work at the University of Memphis, my first job was as a research fellow, akin to a postdoc at Memphis Theological Seminary in the fall of 2008. Shout out to the Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes. And for that year, as that research fellow, I collected the writings of Turner. I was the one at the microfiche machine, cranking out the old newspapers, and no search engine. So I just had to sit through and go through each page to find writings of Bishop Turner, and I collected many of them. I think somewhere in the neighborhood over 1,000 writings, and trying to get them out, trying to write about them, and inviting others to write about them as well. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Johnson. We've been discussing your book, No Future in This Country, The Prophetic Pessimism of Bishop Henry Mcneal Turner, which is available through the University Press of Mississippi. And so www.upress.state.ms.us. And you had put it in the chat earlier.
And Pete, we do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I don't know how we are on time.
Some of those questions I think I've answered.
Yeah, okay. I'm just wondering.
You have, as I've asked questions.
Okay.
A really good one to end with, though, would be the one from Reverend Dr. Earl Fisher. about this transition of prophetic figure transition out of pessimism back into another prophetic posture, or maybe back and forth or around different ones.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Because usually when a person gets to the pessimistic stage, that person eventually leaves the scene, either just by, people not paying any more attention to the person, or by death, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I argue that King is a pessimistic prophet at the end of his life. And if he would have lived, he would have become more pessimistic as time gone on. And I don't think we probably would be, I'm sure we wouldn't have a holiday or the big statue in Washington, D.C. if we would have lived and just followed that trajectory. So that's one. But I'm sure it may have been. I just have not, discovered that as of yet. That someone who was heavily pessimistic, within the Black tradition, there's a whole lot of pessimism, and all of this stuff intersects as well too. When you're writing, you got to have clear lines of demarcation, for the scholarship, so people can, we love our boxes and methods and all of that. So I did that, but in real life, it blends, because sometimes Turner may be pessimistic, and then he gives a speech with young people at a school, and he tells them to go out and succeed. Nothing is stopping you, But last night you were just telling us there's no manhood future for people, for African Americans in the United States of America. So all of it blends. But that's a good question, Dr. Fisher. And if we find anybody that does that, that may be another opportunity for us to expand the Black rhetorical or the Black prophetic tradition in a way that needs to be expanded.
Mm-hmm. Well, given that people transition from, say, celebratory into pragmatic or into pessimistic, it might just depend on the times.
Right, definitely the context.
So it's not abstract, right? I mean, there's a reason Dr. King
right,
more pessimism. There's a reason Henry Mcneal Turner turned to more pessimism. And I think it's a reason why probably a number of us have been pretty pessimistic and continue to be. We're looking for signs of hope.
Right. But the hope, and real quick, the hope, though, comes from the pessimistic prophet, I think, in not giving up, not quitting, being, true to your call, but also helping people understand that your worst enemy in a time of distress is toxic optimism. It is like when the world is just crashing around, when there is nothing that's seemingly stopping this, that you thinking that one speech can change hearts and minds, and you get crushed when it doesn't. I mean, I have seen people, and this is why I began to start thinking this, just my own experience being an activist, seeing people come to rallies, fired up, excited, ready to go, and 3 months later, burnt out and never coming back and just quitting.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and part of that reason is that they thought that, the people that were out there, been doing this for a long time, they were doing it all wrong, and I'm going to do it right. And the mayor would talk to me, and, and when they find out that the mayor or whoever the leader is won't talk to them either because they are part of now the movement, they get crushed. So, but yeah, I mean, I am still working on much of this. I am thinking about doing a third Turner book on his, doing a spiritual biography, talking more about the spirit that Turner has and proclaims his faith. I'm looking at some more writings that I did not include in this book to help me out, like his trips to the spiritualist after his wife died. He goes out into the woods with a bunch of white people, and they were conjuring up his dead wife so he can talk to her because he missed her so much, and how he kind of processes that as a evangelical in the truest sense of the word, believing in God the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and all of that. How does he process all of that? So yeah, so that's coming up.
Well, when that comes out, I hope I'm still doing discussions with the dean, so I can invite you back.
Yeah, we'll do it. We'll do it.
Thank you for a delightful conversation about your book, and I do urge everybody to get a copy and to read this. It really is just such a helpful book for understanding that rhetorical analysis can be part of theological analysis, and really helps with theological analysis, I think. And if you're not a theologian, it's just a great read. If you're sort of at the level of rhetorical analysis, Turner in the hands of Dr. Johnson helps to reveal what's going on at the turn of the century, from the 1800s into the 1900s, in American life in general and African American life in particular. So it's really a fine book, and I thank you, Dr. Johnson, and thanks everybody for participating, and I hope everybody has a good night.
All right, thank you again, and thank you, Brother Nate, for all your hard work as well. And thank you for all who attended, and God bless you, and I'll be around. Hope to see you soon.
Good night, everyone.